Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Last year, when I was single, I downloaded the dating app Tinder and was just experimenting with it. I didn't intend to meet anyone at the time, but I would open it once a day and read a few profiles, by which I mean look at pictures. I'm now a 27-year-old woman, but I was 26 at the time. Joe was a clean-cut guy who appeared almost every time I signed in. He was a little overweight and, if I had to guess, about 6 feet tall. I believe Tinder has a paid feature where they show your profile repeatedly, so maybe he had that, but I didn't care because almost no one actually writes anything. I didn't actually match with anyone because I didn't swipe right once, simply kept swiping left to express disinterest. Once, while I was walking my dog in a park close to my apartment, I noticed a man approaching me on the gravel path. As he approached, he nodded courteously, and I did the same. The man looked familiar, so I thought for a few minutes before realizing it was Joe from Tinder. It wasn't a huge deal, though, because I assumed we do since I live in a large city. The likelihood of me running into Joe was low, but not impossible. Over the course of the following few weeks, I seemed to run into him too frequently, and it started to feel unsettling. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed eyes staring back at me through my window. My apartment was on the second floor, so it would have required some work to get up there. As soon as we looked at each other, he vanished. I went to the window and looked out, and I saw a man fleeing. I could only see him from behind, but I'm fairly certain it was Joe. I called the police right away, and they advised me to spend the night with a friend, which I did. We went to the police station the following day to file a report, but since we had never met online or otherwise, I had no way of getting in touch with Joe. Instead, we came up with a really clever solution. While I was talking to the investigator, I opened the Tinder app and just swiped until Joe's profile appeared. When it did, I informed them that it was him. Story 2. I'm a 23-year-old woman who started using the dating app Hinge a while ago. I had tried a few of the other apps with little success, but I heard from a friend that this one was meant to last. Police filed a restraining order on Joe, and I am happy to report that we haven't crossed paths. To be better, I took her word for it and created a profile. Soon after, I began receiving matches, and one of them was Chris, who was a year older than me, had brown hair, thick glasses, and a beard. We had a nice conversation one evening, and as a result, we decided to meet up in person. We decided to go to a bar that I had visited a few times with friends, but it wasn't my main destination. You should never bring online dates to your favorite places just in case. Was a little late. Chris was waiting for me at the entrance when I arrived, and we had a good time. Chris was a little awkward around people, but it wasn't that bad. I thought he was kind of cute. We had a few drinks and chatted for about 2 hours before we left. Chris would text me occasionally over the next few weeks after we parted ways, about once every 2 or 3 days on average. He would go hours or even days without responding, which is a major red flag for me. So I finally stopped responding to him because I assumed he wasn't ready for someone like me. I didn't mean any offense. Fast forward a few weeks later, and I was bored at home when I was a little taken aback when I received a notification on my phone from Chris, but he asked if I wanted to hang out that night. Since I was bored, I said yes, and this time I gave him my address so he could come get me. Half an hour later, he pulled up in front of my building in a blue Honda Civic with a big dent in the back bumper, which I got into as soon as possible. I decided that as soon as we stopped, I would make an excuse and leave, because we were going to a different bar this time. As soon as Chris parked the car, I pretended that I had an important call and said I had to leave because I could tell by the look on his face that I was uncomfortable. As I mentioned earlier, he was a bit awkward, but this time he hardly said a word. Face that he didn't believe me, but I turned around and left, and he didn't try to stop me when I was on the bus. I blocked and deleted Chris from Hinge, and I also blocked his number on my phone. He didn't do anything particularly bad. It just gave me a strange feeling that I can't quite put into words. But if that was the end of it, then this wouldn't be a particularly frightening story. Over the next few days, Chris added me as a friend on Facebook and followed me on Instagram. I blocked him on both platforms because I was getting a little uneasy. A few days passed with nothing significant happening, but then I began to see some things that truly frightened me. I saw his car parked on the street close to my place of employment, and even close to my apartment building. The dent in the bumper was a clear sign that he was stalking me. A few weeks passed, and I continued to see the car occasionally, but I never saw Chris. Eventually, though, that would change. One evening, as I was walking down the sidewalk after work late, it was dark, and for some reason, a shiver went down my spine. That's when I looked across the was feeling very vulnerable when I saw Chris's car on a very quiet night with almost no one else on the street. Suddenly, I felt like I was being grabbed from behind and a man's arm was wrapped around me. It was Chris, and we struggled for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a few seconds. It was quickly clear that I couldn't overcome him, so I did the only thing I could think to do was to scream as loudly as I could, and I didn't stop until eventually the noise must have been enough to attract attention, because some people from one of the nearby apartment buildings came out onto the street. Chris immediately took off after that, so I called the police that evening and told them everything. Luckily, I had written down Chris' license plate number, so it was easy to find him, and there are still legal charges against him for what he did. I was given a restraining order almost immediately. Looking back, I believe that I should have called the police as soon as I noticed his car parked in my neighborhood, because warning signs like that should never be disregarded, and I nearly paid a terrible price as a result of story 3. I'm Ryan, a 26-year-old man, but this incident occurred a few years ago when I was 25. Like most others, I had been using online dating apps for about 6 months at that point, so I was initially dubious. My biggest worry was that when I went to meet a girl, it would turn out to be my biggest fear was humiliation because of a group of guys playing a practical joke. This story isn't about humiliation, though. What happened to me was much worse. I matched with a girl named Katie on the dating app Bumble, who was my age, had blonde hair, and a few tattoos, which was exactly my type. After exchanging a few messages, I asked her to meet up in person. She accepted, and I sent her my number. Normally, I prefer to cut off communication on the app as soon as possible, because having someone's number makes it feel a little more personal. However, she didn't text me and kept using Bumble's Messenger instead. I assumed she was just checking to make sure I was who I was before sharing any personal information, so I respected that and didn't bring up the matter. You can't be too cautious. Katie suggested that we meet at a small bar in the downtown area, which was conveniently close to my apartment. I walked there and arrived about 10 minutes early, but when I got there, I discovered that the bar was closed because it was a Tuesday evening, which isn't exactly the busiest time for bars. I opened the app and messaged Katie to let her know that I was closed. She responded and recommended a different location down the street. She also informed me that there was a shortcut through a park. I decided to go there and began walking. As I moved down the sidewalk, I checked my messages to see if Katie had updated me, and I saw that she was waiting and advised me to hurry and cut through the park. I agreed and accelerated my pace. 8 p.m. when the sun had set, so by the time I arrived at the park, it was nearly dark, and the little path leading through was dim, so I didn't feel very secure. In order to avoid making my date wait longer than necessary, I started jogging on the sidewalk. When I arrived at the bar, I was exhausted from the run and stood outside for a minute to catch my breath. I used this time to check my messages once more, but when I looked at Bumble, I was shocked to see that Katie had blocked me. I stared at my phone. As I was getting ready, I went into the bar, thinking it was a mistake, so I could just find her, and then we would exchange information if everything went well. I walked around the bar for a few minutes, but Katie was nowhere to be found. The place was small, and she was definitely not there, so I was still breathing heavily and confused as to why she would delete me right before our date. Began to connect the dots. She was guiding me into a trap. She probably recommended the first location because she knew it would be closed, and then she could lead me into the park, which was on the way to this location. I assumed there was some sort of ambush waiting for me, but fortunately, when I arrived, I knew something wasn't right, even though I wasn't sure why at the time. Although I was disappointed and undoubtedly creeped out by this incident, I realized that the plan had failed and that it could have gone much worse. When you meet people online, always trust your gut and avoid doing anything that makes you uncomfortable. While I still think most people are nice, there are some people out there who want to harm you. Story 4. To give you some background, I'm an 18-year-old man who lives in New York. I'm 6'4" and strong, and I've always been one of the bigger guys in my class. I also look older than I actually am since I stopped growing in the 9th grade, which was 4 years ago. I was an 8th grader who could already grow a full beard. There are one of us in every school. This happened last month, right after my 18th birthday. I was lonely after breaking up with my 7-month girlfriend, so I turned to Tinder. I made a profile with my real photos and lied about my age. Claiming to be 24, I was matched with a stunning girl who was nearly too good to be true. Be honest, but I accepted it nevertheless. We sent each other a few harmless messages and agreed to meet at our house at 9 p.m. the next day. I wasn't as thrilled as you may have been, as it got close to 9 p.m. the following day. I believe I began to question if she was real. Before I went, I was getting ready to visit her. I texted my dad to let him know that I was heading to a friend's house. Since I didn't have a car, I asked my good friend James, who was 6 years my senior, to drive me to her apartment. I rang the doorbell and heard faint footsteps behind it, followed by a high-pitched voice saying, "Be right there." At that point, I texted James to let him know that everything was okay, and that he could leave. When the door opened, I was incredibly relieved to see the girl from the photos in person, but that relief would not last long because as soon as I walked in, she asked if I wanted a drink. I politely declined, which caused her demeanor to noticeably change. This sparked a red flag, and I started to doubt her intentions because I thought I might be in trouble. I asked to use the restroom so I could call my friend, and she complied. Enthusiastically, I went into the restroom and immediately texted James for a ride. When I looked up from my phone, I could just make out what appeared to be a dark figure behind the shower curtain. Before I knew what I was seeing, the figure leapt out like a cat, and I ended up in a wrestling match with this enigmatic man. I was terrified, despite the fact that I was much bigger than him. I was 6'4" and 210 pounds, and he was probably 510,165 pounds and bald, looking to be in his mid-30s. Once I had my act together, I was able to overwhelm him. I quickly knocked him to the ground and punched him in the face 2 or 3 times. James then texted me to let me know that he was waiting outside the building. At that moment, the girl screamed and ran into the bathroom. I hurried past her and left the apartment. I frantically told him what had happened in the car before realizing that I might have been drugged, mugged, or worse. I took screenshots of her profile and all of our messages together. But even with all of that evidence, the police couldn't do much because it was just my word against theirs. I only got a little scare out of this one, and the lesson is that You should always meet in public for your first date and probably your second, too. Story 5. Safely. I was in a difficult financial situation after my marriage ended. I was working part-time as a server and had an apartment that I couldn't afford. It wasn't fancy or anything, but I didn't make enough money to pay the rent. At that point, I started using Tinder to meet new people. Used it before. In fact, that's how I met my first husband. One evening, I was at home browsing the app, and no one really caught my eye. Perhaps I was being picky, or perhaps I wasn't over my ex yet, but after a while, an intriguing profile appeared. His name was Jay, and he was actually a few years younger than me. Normally, I'm interested in older men, but not too much older. Before, I had never dated anyone younger. I went through each of his photos a few times, showing him in various settings, such as a WH sand beach, New York City, and even one of Jay, where he appeared to be standing in front of a private jet. I know I sound shallow, but that's the truth about what made him stand out. And it wasn't the only thing that piqued my interest. Stand out at first, I swiped right on Jay, which was the only right swipe I had done so far. I then put my phone away and went to bed. When I woke up the following morning, I saw that I had a match on Tinder, and I knew it was Jay, because that was the only person I had accepted. I then checked my messages and saw that he had already gotten in touch with me, said hi, which is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. If you're going to get in touch with me, try saying a little more than that. I decided to overlook it this time, though, and we began talking after only 5 or 10 messages each. Jay asked me out on a date, which I accepted, and we planned to go out to a really nice restaurant the following Friday night. He was a little more awkward than I would have suggested. I'm not sure why we had a good conversation, but there were more awkward silences than usual. However, it was a first date, and first dates can be awkward. When the bill arrived, I was a little worried that Jay would want to split the cost of the night. I wasn't sure how much it would be, but I knew I couldn't afford it, so I was relieved when Jay took it. Jay and I went out a few more times over the next few weeks, just like before, and we always had a pretty good time. However, there was something strange about him, as if he was trying too hard to impress me. It was obvious that he had money, and he wasn't scared to spend it on me things. From the table without hesitation, we parted ways, and I took the bus home. We're becoming increasingly extravagant. He took me on a river cruise over the weekend, which must have cost at least a few $1,000s in total. I don't mean to come across as unappreciative, but it did seem like a warning sign. Things reached a breaking point when Jay texted me to invite me to travel to Mexico, but I wasn't prepared, even though it was enticing. I felt horrible for making that kind of step, but I ended our relationship over text message. When my phone rang, it was Jay. I answered, and the first thing I heard were the most disgusting, hateful insults I had ever heard. This guy was angry. I had never seen this side of him before. Jay was a really shy and courteous guy when we were dating. I was terrified because I didn't know what this guy was capable of, and he also knew where I lived because he dropped me off at my apartment a couple of times before the next morning. When I turned on my phone, I saw dozens of missed calls and a ton of messages from Jay, the exact contents of which I can't recall. The screaming continued for a minute or two, so I finally hung up and turned it off. Of the messages, but they were full of the same insults as before, so I didn't respond for a few days. Eventually, though, I made the decision to call him and try to work things out. He answered the phone and began yelling at me, as before, despite my best efforts to calm him down. He even claimed that I had to reimburse him for all the dates we had gone on, something I couldn't afford to do. So I hung up once more and went to work the following evening. At the time, I was working nights as a server, and I spent the entire evening worrying about Jay, fearing that he would come after me for the money or worse. I left work at around 1 a.m. I took the bus home. My heart fell when I arrived at my front door. which was wide open. I cautiously entered, and as soon as I did, I knew someone had been there. My thoughts instantly turned to Jay, and I screamed out hello, but he did not answer, so I strolled through the area in terror, flowing through my body. When I arrived at my bedroom, I saw something on my bed, a piece of paper. I picked it up and turned it over, and the words "You're dead" were written there. That was enough, so I fled and didn't return. That evening, I went to my friend's house and called the police, who were able to arrest Jay using the evidence and my testimony that they were able to collect from my apartment after the police questioned Jay and discovered that he was completely broke and was using borrowed funds from multiple credit cards to pay for our dates. For a while, I didn't understand this, but after watching a documentary on Netflix, it began to make sense. In the documentary, a man used Tinder to woo women with lavish presents and dates, and then he would deceive them into borrowing money to repay him, and he would then promise to do so, but he would never do so. My relationship with Jay never progressed that far, but I believe it was a precursor to Story 6. I was in my early 20s and met one of my best friends at a tiny ice cream shop. Her name was Melanie, and she was a year younger than me. I was like a big sister to her, and we always tried to have our shifts together, which were typically in the evenings, because the more experienced employees were given the day shifts. The establishment had a few busy times during the night, usually after the movie ended, and the big movie theater nearby served as the primary source of patrons. We would use that time to chat and gossip about our personal lives. At the time, I had a stable boyfriend, and Melanie, on the other hand, was on multiple dating apps. She was about 5'8", with short blonde hair and slightly overweight. She mostly used Tinder and would frequently show me her matches and the awkward openers that they would send her. We were standing behind the counter at the store, huddled around her phone, laughing, and she then showed me a new match. We had been together since high school, so I had no experience with dating apps. His name was Troy, and he was 27 years old. He had glasses, a short beard, and longish black hair. He looked really good, almost like a model. At first, I thought it might be fake, but I didn't want to be a downer, so I kept my mouth shut. Melanie then informed me that they were going on their first date. I wished her well on our date the next night, and after she put her phone away and we wrapped up our shift for the evening, I called her at approximately 11 p.m. She didn't respond to inquire about the date's progress, which I interpreted as positive, so I went to bed. The following night, Melanie and I had a shift together, and I was eager to see how the date went. When I arrived at work, however, Melanie was nowhere to be found. Since she rarely arrived late, I called her phone, but no one answered, and since I didn't have her parents' number, I was at a loss for what to do. I waited at the store for about 30 minutes before I finally lost it and called the police. I spoke with the officer and learned that Melanie's mother had reported her missing the previous evening. She never returned from the date, and weeks passed with no word from her. I kept working at the shop, but it was really hard without her. I couldn't stop thinking about her. I was in constant communication with her mother, and I was angry at the police for not moving forward with the case. After more than 2 weeks, another week passed with no word regarding Melanie, and I was so frustrated that I had to come up with a plan. I created a Tinder profile and added some of my cuttest pictures because I remembered the face of the man Melanie had gone out with that evening. Opened the app and began swiping. I had no idea if the pictures I saw were real, but I had to try. I swiped left to pass on every profile because my only concern was finding the guy who took Melanie out that night. It took an hour or so, but finally I found what appeared to be the guy. It said his name was Chad, but I was fairly certain it was Troy before I spent a minute looking through the profiles. I immediately put my phone away and tried to forget about it. Later that day, I opened the app and saw that I had a message from him. I was both excited and disgusted, because this might hold the secret to my friend's fate. I replied to his message and I'm ashamed to admit that what I typed was extremely provocative. I needed this guy to be after a few more messages. Chad asked me out on a date, which I enthusiastically accepted. The following evening, we went out for drinks at a small bar on the opposite side of town, and I couldn't help but cry when I noticed him sitting at a table in a distant corner of the dimly lit room. He looked exactly like his photos, which surprised me, so I sat down and forced a smile, but it was not real, nearly made me cry. We spoke for about an hour, and even though it was widely reported, I didn't bring up Melanie. As I sat there staring at this guy, I wondered what he knew. He gave me the creeps, and I had a strong suspicion that he was involved in whatever happened to Melanie. I thought about what I should do next. The plan was to just contact him, but to be honest, I didn't think it would work now that I was there. I didn't know what to do, so I continued talking to Chad until he asked me to return to his place. I politely declined. Then I excused myself, got up, and left as fast as I could. When I reached the street, I called 911, spoke with the detective working Melanie's case, and I told him what I had done. I was relieved that the officer believed me and took my claim seriously. I gave Chad's information to them, and they said they would investigate. A week later, I learned that Chad had been arrested and admitted to accidentally killing Melanie. He even led them to her body. I still work at the ice cream shop, but I've never completely moved on from what happened to my friend. Discovering the truth, but it's still difficult. I'm 36 years old, and this happened to me when I was 30. I had never had much success with women, most likely due to my extreme shyness and introversion. I've tried going out with friends, but I've never been comfortable around crowds, so dance clubs are pretty much the last place I've ever wanted to be. As a result, it's always been really hard for me to meet women. I'm not a bad-looking guy. I'm tall and reasonably fit, so I felt like I had an advantage because I much prefer to be judged on my appearance rather than I was chatting to a really attractive woman named Shelley on the dating app OkCupid. She looked like a fashion model or something, and I couldn't believe she was interested in me. We spoke every night for more than 2 weeks before she finally asked me to meet in person. I suggested that we go out to dinner, but she accepted. I assumed it would be some sort of luxury penthouse or something, but when the time came, I took the bus to the address Shelley gave me, and when I arrived, it was an older house that was in dire need of repair. That alone should have raised a lot of red flags, but I agreed anyhow. A single-story building with a double car garage. It had light blue vinyl siding with several panels missing, and the roof was made of brown shingles that were all curled up, indicating that they needed to be replaced. Since there were no lights on the house, I texted Shelley to confirm that I was in the correct place. Immediately responded and instructed me to enter through the garage. I turned to face the garage, where a large door was slightly open at the bottom, allowing me to squeeze through without bending over. I was nervous, but I was also very excited to meet this girl, so I walked up the driveway to the open garage door, stood in front of it, then leaned down to look inside. I saw that there was no car in the far corner of the garage, so I leaned down and squeezed through the gap. When I stood up and looked around, I saw a man in a mask standing across the room with a knife in his hand. As soon as our eyes met, the door began to slide down, and the man began running at me. I fell to the ground, unrolled. I jumped up and ran out of the garage, missing the automatic door by a few inches. A few blocks away, I saw a busy Dunkin' Donuts, and I knew I was safe. After I had a chance to catch my breath, I decided not to call the police because, to be honest, I was embarrassed to have fallen for that scam and embarrassed to have started using online dating. About a year later, while watching the news, I learned that someone else had gone through a similar situation to mine, but it didn't end as well. I now realized that I could have saved someone's life that night if ID had reported it, but I didn't, and it still bothers me greatly. Story 8. I had been able to stay away from dating apps for a while, but I was having trouble finding a good guy at bars and clubs, so I decided to give it a shot one evening when I was browsing Tinder. Pat was the profile that caught my attention, and we spoke for a while and agreed to grab drinks. I gave him my address, and he said he would come get me at about 7. I dressed nervously and anxiously awaited his arrival. As I stood outside my apartment building, I noticed a car pull up. It was a dilapidated old truck, and I wasn't sure it was him. But when it arrived in front of my building, I knew it was Pat. He was tall with short, he was wearing jeans and a plaid shirt, and he had a big smile on his face. He had blonde hair and a patchy beard. He approached me and gave me a big hug, which made me feel both excited and a little uncomfortable. We got into his truck, and he asked if I was hungry, to which I replied that I wasn't, but he told me that he knew a great place for drinks that was a little out of our town. However, he assured me that it would be worthwhile. I was hesitant at first, but he was so charming and convincing that I finally agreed. As we drove out of town, I noticed that the buildings were getting farther apart and the trees were getting thicker. I started to get a little anxious, but I tried to tell myself that it was just my nerves because I had only recently met this person. When we got to the bar, I realized it wasn't the type of place I was used to. It was dim and small, and it smelled like stale beer. When we walked in, everyone turned to stare at us, and I felt even more uncomfortable. Pat ordered drinks and attempted to get me a shot, but I refused. He persisted, though, and I finally gave in because I thought it might help me relax. I tried to listen and not join in, but I felt that Pat was full of himself and that he wasn't the type of guy I wanted to spend the rest of the night with. As we sat there talking, all he seemed to do was boast about himself. He talked about all the fights he had been in and how he once saved a child from drowning. Pat, a man I hardly knew, kept trying to get me to drink more while I was in the middle of nowhere. When I started feeling sick, I told him I wanted to leave, but he refused to take me. He said we were having fun and I shouldn't ruin it, but I knew I couldn't stay any longer, so I made up an excuse and told him I had an early morning. My heart was pounding as he pulled over to the side of the road and said, "Just get out then." He seemed hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to drive me back to my apartment. As we drove there, I felt a wave of relief, but then Pat became irate, accusing me of wasting his time and driving me all the way there for nothing. "I'm not taking you any farther." I got out of the truck and began to walk down the road, not knowing where I was going but knowing that I had to get away from him. I heard him shouting at me as he drove away, but I didn't answer because I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. I just kept walking, feeling the chill of the night on my skin, shivering, and my feet beginning to hurt. I realized that I didn't know where I was going. After walking for nearly an hour, I saw a car approaching, so I stuck out my thumb and hoped they would stop. The car slowed down, and I saw an older couple. I felt like I was in a nightmare, and I had no way to call for help because my phone was still broken. I couldn't believe I'd been so stupid to trust this guy, and I felt like I put myself in danger, and I didn't know how to get out of it. When they asked if I needed a ride, I nearly started crying with relief. They drove me to the closest town and dropped me off at a gas station. I went inside and called a friend to come get me, telling her enough to know that I truly needed help, but not enough to make her believe it. When I got home, I collapsed onto my bed and sobbed because I couldn't believe what had happened. It took me some time to move past that experience, but I eventually did. I learned from it and grew from it, and I made a promise to myself that I would never put myself in that kind of situation again. After that night, I felt like I had been so foolish to trust a stranger. I never spoke to Pat again, deleted his number, and blocked him. I also realized that I gave Pat my address before we even met, which was a mistake I won't do again. I live in a big apartment building, so it would be hard for him to find me. We met in a public area with many of other people, Tinder was relatively new when I started using it, so I was surprised by how many matches I received after setting up my profile. I'd always wanted to meet someone the old-fashioned way, but my work schedule was extremely hectic, so I finally decided to give it a try. I started using Tinder around 2015, was actually only 3 or 4 before that, but even so, that was more than I had anticipated. One of them was Tanya, who was stunningly beautiful with long, curly hair. We clicked immediately, and after a few days of conversation, we decided to meet at a park close to my apartment. On the day of our date, I got to the park early. It was a pleasant day with the sun shining and a light breeze blowing through as the minutes passed. I started to get nervous because it was past the time we had agreed upon. I checked my phone every few seconds to see if she had cancelled or gotten lost, and as the sun started to set, I started to worrying, but I had been stood up. The park was peaceful, with only a few families and couples strewn about. When I heard footsteps behind me, a long shadow was cast by the late day sun. I turned to see 3 men, all about 25, coming toward me. 2 of them were very big, and I felt anxious as they drew nearer, trying to prepare myself for what was going to happen. "Hey man, how are you?" one of the guys asked. "Fine," I said. "Can you spare a few bucks?" Another guy said. "Sorry, I don't have any change," I told him, and I got up to leave, but 2 of the guys blocked me. Then one of them asked, "Can I see your wallet?" I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us, starting to realize what was going on. I tried to squeeze past them once more, but they didn't retreat. Instead, they approached me, and one of them grabbed me by the arm. I attempted to free myself, but his hold was like a vice, and the other 2 men circled me, looking very menacing. I knew I had to act quickly, so I swung my free arm and made contact with one of them, who staggered back clutching his nose, and the other 2 guys hesitated for a second. So I took them by surprise and ran away from them as quickly as I could. I glanced back every few steps to see that they were pursuing me, but I was obviously the faster runner, so I just kept going. When I finally stopped gasping for air and panting, I realized I was in a new area of the city and had no landmarks to help me find my way. I looked up a map on my phone to find my location and how to get back to my apartment, and once I had my bearings, I called an Uber because I didn't want to risk walking home and getting discovered by those guys. I was extremely embarrassed about what had happened, and I tried to act like it was nothing. I didn't start crying until I got home. After I had had time to collect myself, I checked my phone and realized that Tanya wasn't real. I assumed those guys had created a phony profile to trick me, so it wasn't the most clever scam because I only had $20 or $30 in. I was shocked to see a new message from Tanya when I opened the Tinder app. It said something like, "Hey, I'm sorry, I missed you. I had a family emergency and I had to take my dad to the hospital." At first, I wasn't sure if this was a sincere message or if she was just trying to confuse me. When I asked Tanya what had happened, she replied, "My dad had a heart attack and had to go to the hospital." It was really intense. I don't know what to tell you. The guy was upset that I had punched him and that he wanted revenge, so I decided to respond just to see what she would say. That was pretty much the end of it, but a few months later, I was walking down the street near my house and I'm pretty sure I saw one of those guys. I didn't call her out directly on the off chance that it was real. Instead, I just unmatched her and moved on with my life because I was too ashamed to call the police. I didn't know how they could find those guys anyway because I didn't have any real information for them. I kept thinking about how embarrassing it would be if I ran into one of those guys at the grocery store or the gym. It hasn't occurred yet, but I'll submit an update if anything happens. He didn't notice me when I got off the bus. It was quite unsettling to think that those individuals are out there. As it happens, I've been using Tinder intermittently for a few years. I'd also used other dating apps, but when I moved to Denver, Tinder was very popular I recall the first time I saw his profile, I swiped right because his pictures were interesting and his bio was funny. And then I put my phone away for the night. When I opened it again, I discovered that we were matched, and we immediately began chatting. And he struck me as charming, funny, and intelligent. We discussed our hobbies, careers, and families, and we clicked almost immediately. I remember being anxious about whether he would be as wonderful in person as he seemed online, but all of my concerns vanished the moment I laid eyes on him. He was tall, attractive, and had a warm smile. After that first date, we began seeing each other more frequently. We went to restaurants, museums, parks, and just strolled around the city while talking. I think he looked even better than his photos. We hugged and talked, sipped coffee, and laughed about insignificant things. It felt like we had known each other 4 years. I felt like I had found someone who truly understood me, someone who made me feel loved. But then things started to change. He would text me all the time, even when I was at work or with friends, and he would get upset if I didn't respond right away, accusing me of ignoring him. He would also show up at my apartment without warning, wanting to hang out, even though I had other commitments. I initially believed that his plans were merely an expression of his love and concern for me, but as time passed, it became increasingly intrusive. I attempted to talk to him about it, but he would become defensive and irate, saying things like, "I'm the only person I have in the world, and I can't live without you." You would accuse me of flirting with other men and not truly loving him. But none of that was even true. It felt suffocating, like I was constantly walking on eggshells around him. I couldn't be alone anymore, couldn't talk to my friends, or do the things I enjoyed without feeling guilty or nervous. I began to dread his calls and texts, wondering what new demands he had. It was almost like he was living in a different reality, one where I was the only source of his happiness and meaning in life. It was exhausting to know that accusations would be waiting for me, but one day, he showed up at work, and when I tried to tell him to leave, he started yelling and making a scene. My co-workers had to call security to get him out, which was really embarrassing. Fortunately, my boss was very understanding and I wouldn't have blamed him if he fired me for it. Instead, he told me to quiet down and take a break. After that incident, I knew I had to break up with him. I tried to do it gently over the phone, but he refused to accept it. He begged me to give him another chance and promised that he would never do anything like that again. But I knew deep down that things wouldn't get better, and that I needed to leave him before things got worse. I love my co-workers. He would send me pictures of me and my friends from social media with the words, "I know where you are and I'm watching you." He would then show up at places where he knew I'd be just trying to catch a glimpse of me. At first, the messages were just pleading, desperate messages telling me how much he loved me and that he needed me. But they soon turned into threats, angry messages accusing me of betraying him or leading him on. I tried blocking his number because I was afraid and didn't know what to do, but he would just make new ones. I also changed my social media settings to make them private, but he still managed to see my posts. When I went to the police, they told me there wasn't much they could do unless he really hurt me. But one night, I was watching TV by myself when I heard a noise I went to the window outside my apartment and saw him standing there, staring at me. I freaked out, locked all the windows and doors, and called the police. He began beating on the door, trying to break it, but his force was too great. When the police arrived, he was arrested, spent the night in jail, and I discovered that he was extremely inebriated when he was released the following day. I never found out exactly what made the difference. Perhaps it was the fear of legal repercussions, or perhaps his friends and family helped out, but I'm glad that things didn't get worse. It's been 2 years, and I'm still worried that I'll run into him somewhere if that happens. Eventually, I was granted a restraining order because of that incident, and after that, things got much better. I had never been to New York City before, but I was there for a business conference, So as I got off the plane at JFK, I had a mixture of nerves and excitement. I downloaded the Tinder app in the days before my trip and sifted through a ton of profiles until I found a match. Her name was Tracy, and she was a student at NYU. We clicked right away, and we quickly arranged to meet up. She suggested that we watch the sunset in Central Park, and I accepted. I was glad to have a local to hang out with because I wouldn't have known what the benefits were to do. As I traveled to the park, I noticed Tracy sitting on a bench close by. The noise and energy of the city were unlike anything I had ever experienced before, and as I entered the park, the bustling streets and towering skyscrapers vanished, to be replaced by the tranquil sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. The lake's long brown hair blew in the wind as I walked up to her. She looked up and smiled, and I felt a shock of electricity go through my body. We talked and laughed for the next hour as the sun set, and then we decided to take a stroll around the park, admiring the scenery as we went down the winding path. Reminded me of every romantic comedy film I've ever seen. The park seemed almost magical, and the night was cool and quiet as we strolled through it. We talked about everything and nothing. We stopped to take some pictures, and as I raised my phone, I noticed a man approaching us. Before I could react, he came up to us and brandished a gun. I froze and began to shake when he said, "Me, your wallets, and your phones." I wanted to run, but I knew I couldn't because I could feel the cold sweat on my forehead. I reached into my pocket and took out my wallet, while my hand was still shaking, and Tracy did the same, her eyes wide. We stood there for a few minutes, too shocked and afraid to move, before the man fled into the night after taking our phones and wallets out of fear. We eventually made our way back to the hotel, both of us shaken and traumatized, and immediately called the police. The following few days were a blur of police reports and cancelled credit cards. It was a really terrible experience, and I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to return to New York City again, because I had never been mugged before. It's not that common where I come from. Tracy and I stayed in contact over the next few weeks, texting and talking on the phone, but I haven't been back since I reported my phone stolen, which is supposed to make it useless to thieves. They probably have a way around that, though. I don't know if this is the scariest experience of all time. Some of you have likely gone through worse, but for story 12, it was extremely frightening. Tracy and I haven't spoken in over a year, and I'm sure she's moved on. I met a guy on Tinder a few years ago, probably more like 5 years ago, and it was actually the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. We had been talking for a few days when he asked me out on a date, and I accepted, but I was anxious because I'm always pretty cautious when I meet new people. I made sure to meet in a busy coffee shop in the middle of the city, and since I didn't have a car at the time, I took the bus there. It took me about 30 minutes, and I arrived 10 minutes early, and after waiting outside for a minute or two, James came up to me. I was relieved to see him for the first time. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked just like his photos, if not better. We clicked immediately, and we chatted for 2 hours, during which I laughed and had a great time. I lost track of time, and the coffee shop closed when we left, so James offered to drive me home. I was hesitant at first, but I accepted because I felt comfortable and like I knew him. I got into his car, and we drove, talking the entire time, and I was still having a great time. Then everything went wrong. We were traveling down a busy street when I noticed a police car's flashing lights behind us. James began to speed up and curse under his breath, which made me panic. I thought I had yelled for him to stop, but he ignored me, and the police car kept chasing us. I was terrified because I had never been in a car accident before. I didn't think I was hurt, but I wasn't sure. A few seconds later, I saw two police officers with their guns pointed at us, and James was attempting to flee as the sirens grew louder and I realized we were in trouble. James made a sharp turn, and the car skidded on the pavement, colliding with a fence before coming to a stop. car, but the police yelled for him to stay inside. I was crying and trembling, wondering what I had done. The police handcuffed us and placed us in different cars. I could see James speaking to one of them, but I couldn't hear him. After a few more minutes, the officers approached me and informed me that James was a wanted criminal who had been the officers, took me to the station to essentially repeat my side of the story again that we were done, and then they called a cab to take me back to my apartment. I couldn't sleep that night because I kept replaying the events of that date with a criminal, and the car we were driving was stolen. I couldn't believe it. It took me a long time to recover from the incident. I felt like I had been duped and was upset with myself for not seeing the warning signs, but in the end, I realized that I couldn't hold myself responsible because James had lied to me and he put me in danger. I spent the evening trying to make sense of everything. I had trusted James, and he turned out to be a complete psycho. I learned a valuable lesson about trusting strangers, especially those I meet online. I still use dating apps, but I take my time getting to know someone before meeting them in person, and I don't get in a car with someone I barely know. I realized that I was fortunate to have escaped unharmed, but it could have been much worse. Story 13. I've met a lot of people through dating apps over the years, and I could tell you more stories, but this one is about someone I didn't really meet. I was at home playing with my phone, occasionally checking my Tinder messages and browsing through the main apps, Twitter and Instagram, when I noticed a new message from a girl named Cassandra. She was attractive, but not as amazing as some of those phony model profiles that occasionally appear. I'm pretty good at spotting that kind of stuff, so I immediately replied to her message, and we had a decent conversation, no deep or anything, but I could tell she was interested, so I didn't waste any time and asked her out right away. I wasn't picky, so I didn't argue when she suggested a place in a neighborhood I didn't know much about. She sent me the address, and I looked it up on Google Maps. I was a little hesitant because it was in a pretty sketchy part of town, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to come across as weak. As the date day drew near, I became more and more anxious and had a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right, but I couldn't quite place it. I tried to suggest a different place, but she was very insistent about it, which made me even more suspicious. Eventually, I decided that I needed to see her in person before we met, so I asked if she would be open to a video chat, and surprisingly she agreed, but I was really expecting her to reject me or to completely ignore me. When the video call went through, I saw her sitting in a dark room with her hair covering part of her face and her face partially hidden by shadows. She looked up at me and smiled, but there was something strange about her, and as we spoke, I noticed more and more things that she couldn't recall. I don't know what her intentions were, but I knew I had to leave this situation as soon as possible. She didn't seem to know much about the city we were in, and worse of all, she didn't look anything like her pictures. At that point, I could hardly recognize her, which confirmed my suspicions that it was some sort of trap. It's possible that I didn't call her out or anything. I just made a clumsy excuse. She seemed disappointed, but didn't fight back, so I hung up the phone, immediately unmatched her, and blocked her on Tinder. I took a few weeks off from online dating after that, so I'm still unsure of who the woman in the video was. I'm quite sure I escaped a really awful night in Story 14, even though I always had difficulties meeting females when I was younger. For some reason, they always perceived me as a buddy. Cool. Maybe it was a friend of somebody I was talking to. Maybe she was just hired to do it on F or something. Nothing more. I had a relationship in college, but it ended when we graduated. My friends have been urging me to get back out there, so I thought I might as well add some excitement to my life. I joined Plenty of Fish, one of the most popular dating sites at the time, in early February of 2010. I looked around for about an hour before I saw her picture. Her name was Brandy, and she had long black hair, glasses, and a really wholesome appearance overall. Online dating was still relatively new, and there was still some stigma attached to it. It was still perceived as desperate or pathetic, unlike now when everyone does it. We messaged back and forth for she told me she had a friend coming from out of town and suggested that we all get together. I was a little nervous about that, but she reassured me that her friend was really cool and that it wouldn't be strange because I was really new to dating at the time. A few days before she suggested that we meet up, I was both nervous and excited because she seemed like a fun, adventurous person, and I was looking forward to getting to know her. We decided to meet at a bar downtown, and as I approached the entrance, I saw Brandy waiting. Brandy was even more gorgeous in person, with a curvy figure and long dark hair. But there was a man with it, who was over 6 feet tall and had short hair. I didn't realize how odd that was, though, because I usually perform better one-on-one. Thick, muscular arms, and as I got closer, I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Hey Chris, Brandy. This is my friend Nick." I thought her friend would be a girl, so I was shocked to see a guy there. If I had known that, I wouldn't have agreed to the date, but I didn't have the guts to leave, so the three of us went into the bar, ordered some drinks, and sat down at a table. Brandy and Nick talked. We ordered another round of drinks, and then things started to get fuzzy. My head was spinning, my vision was blurry, and the next thing I knew, I woke up. I tried to join the conversation about their jobs and their hobbies, while I sat silently feeling really uncomfortable, but it was obvious they weren't interested in getting to know me. I realized that I had been drugged and kidnapped when I tried to scream in the back of a car, but my mouth was covered in duct tape. I looked up to see Nick and Brandy in the front seat, but they didn't seem to notice that I had woken up, so I kept quiet, so they would believe I was still asleep. This was my chance. I had to move quickly. I unlocked the door and ran into traffic, nearly getting hit by a car on my way. I could hear muffled voices coming from the front seat, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. After a few minutes, the car finally came to a stop, and I could see the glow of a red traffic light. I turned around and saw the stunned. I must have had a high tolerance for whatever drugs they gave me based on Brandy's face. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to leave as soon as possible. I looked back, and they weren't following me, so I assumed they didn't want to cause a scene. My legs and lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop, didn't slow down, and I just kept pushing myself out of fear, and the area was unfamiliar to me, so I kept running despite the adrenaline feeling in my pockets even though I knew I had escaped. I looked around to get my bearings, but I didn't recognize any of the buildings or streets, and I wasn't even sure what part of town I was in. I stumbled down the street, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed help. I was stumbling, disheveled, and desperate, but no one stopped or even seemed to notice me. Eventually, a woman about my mother's age stopped and asked if I was okay. I was slurring my words and still feeling very woozy, so I assumed I just looked like some drunk guy, which is probably why no one else would stop. When she phoned the police after I told her what had happened to me earlier, a flurry of police officers and paramedics arrived. It was a flurry of activity, a whirlwind of confusion and mayhem, but I was happy that I would be all right despite everything. They took me to the hospital first. After being examined for any injuries or drug side effects, I was cleared to go home a few hours later. The police then brought me to the station, where I gave a more thorough account of what had happened. They assured me that they would do everything within their power to track down the people who had abducted me and bring them to justice. But I was of little assistance because I had no real information from Brandy and Nick. In the midst of everything, I neglected to get their license plate, and the phone number Brandy provided me was a fake one. Nevertheless, they were eventually apprehended, and for a while, this incident made headlines in my town and among my community. As I mentioned earlier, it was a major factor in the stigma associated with online dating. It was more than 10 years ago, and currently everyone uses it. In any case, I've been married for more than 5 years, and I'm grateful that I don't have to meet people online anymore. I began using T-Hasten in 2015, and I've had some positive experiences, and I was about 2 months out of a fairly committed relationship when I made my profile. I had previously used Tinder, but I deleted it when I met my ex. I swiped for 10 or 15 minutes before finding my first match, Kevin, who had a charming smile that instantly caught my attention. This is about one of the worst things that has ever happened to me on any dating app. After a few days of chatting, he asked me to meet up in person. We agreed to grab drinks at a nearby bar. On the day of the date, I took some time to get ready, wearing my favorite dress and applying flawless hair and makeup. When I got to the bar, I noticed Kevin waiting outside. He was shorter than I had anticipated and had a nerdy appearance, but it wasn't that bad. I smiled and greeted him despite my reservations, because everyone lies on their profiles. I didn't feel like he was catfishing me or anything. We sat down at a table and ordered drinks first, and the conversation began, flowed easily, and we discussed our interests and pastimes. In fact, I was carrying the conversation and doing the majority of the talking. I was fairly certain at first that I wouldn't see him again, but I stayed because I didn't want to be impolite. However, as time went on, I began to feel that he was a little awkward. He kept avoiding eye contact and fidgeting with his hands, which made me feel I tried to ignore it and carry on the conversation. But after having one drink, I was relieved to say goodbye and go home, because my place was only 10 minutes or so away. I walked up the stairs of my building, and as I was ready to open my front door, I turned to face Kevin, who was standing on the sidewalk, staring at me. The worst part was that he knew where I lived. If I had seen him sooner, I could have prevented him from seeing which building belonged to me, but it was too late. I hesitated for a few seconds before rushing into my building's lobby. Once inside, I checked my Tinder messages and chose not to unmatch or block him because I wanted to preserve any. There had been no new messages from him, so I went to bed trying to convince myself that it was all a coincidence and that it wasn't him. I even tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, but I knew that wasn't true. He had also told me which part of town he lived in, and it was in the opposite direction. I knew in my heart that he was following me, and the days that followed were characterized by anxiety and paranoia. I kept checking my phone to make sure he hadn't messaged me, which was a relief, but I couldn't help but worrying that I had a stalker. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a knock on the door. I was walking toward the door when I noticed a figure standing across from me. I'm not sure how he knew which apartment belonged to me, but I assumed that he had been following me and spying on me possibly. He saw me through the window or something. I told him to leave, but he tried to act as though it wasn't a big deal. He had a sheepish expression on his face and tried to apologize, but I was so freaked out that I threatened to call the police, and he left. I called my brother that night and went over to his place, where I slept on the couch. I wish that was the end of it, but it wasn't. After I returned home, things were normal for a while, but I started seeing Kevin on the street far too frequently, and I even started seeing him at the gym, even though the one I go to is far from where he claimed to live. I called the police, but they were powerless to help. After a month, I made the decision to relocate, finding a new home in a different neighborhood. Fortunately, I haven't seen him since. I still get paranoid occasionally, but I'm fairly certain it's. Here's a little backstory. I'm a 22-year-old female truck driver who is also a lesbian. I like to wear loose-fitting clothing and wear my hair up. Story 16 regarding the event I'm going to share with you is true, and it truly altered my perspective on online dating and hookups. And tight, I've experienced a lot of crazy things in my brief life, including having to cut people with knives to defend myself and ending arguments with grown men. I've seen the works. This occurred when I was around 18 years old, and I started to wonder about my sexuality and what it would be like to be with a guy. Until then, I had only been with women, so I was very in order to satisfy my curiosity. I went online and downloaded the Meet Me in search of someone I might be interested in app. There were a lot of creeps and superfluous pictures there, but eventually I found a guy, let's call him Mike, and we started talking. He was really cool, laid back, and very out there. He asked if we could meet after a few days of chatting and getting to know one another, and I said yes, of course. However, looking back, I regret downloading that app. We planned to meet at his place to hang out, eat, and play video games. Just have a relaxing evening. I know what you're thinking. Are you stupid? That's how people are kidnapped in movies. I don't know this guy, and you should have met him in public, but I was curious and young, so I put all my chips on the table. It was a night when I went to his house, and it was pleasant. We talked and ate pizza for a while, and then things got heated, and we did the dirty. After everything was said and done, we were lying there, enjoying each other's company, when I heard a scream. I thought, Mike. When he returned, Mike asked, "What are you doing? Why are you getting your stuff?" I thought we were having a good time. I and my brother might have come home and put on a movie. Don't worry, I'll go check it out. I was sitting in his room, half naked, trying to gather my belongings in case something happened, but he returned and said, "What are you doing?" I told him, "Oh, I got a text from my dad. I have to get going." He's wondering where I am. I told him I was on my way back. "Oh, okay. Let me walk you out," because I thought that screen was too real and too close to be the TV. I told him good night. You might be wondering why I didn't call the police, but I never had, until I learned 2 days later on the news that good old Mike and his brother had abducted, assaulted, and starved their stepfather for 2 weeks. They allowed him to go to a doctor's appointment, but he immediately went to the police, who apprehended them. I began to cry at that moment because I thought that might have been me with that old man Mike. Mike, I hope you're having fun in jail, and that you stay there for a long time. Story 17. When I was younger, I used dating apps frequently, but fortunately I don't now. They drugged me and tied me up. It could have been much worse if I had stayed, used them anymore. In fact, I did eventually meet my wife on OkCupid. However, this is about a negative encounter I had with a Tinder user approximately 5 years ago. I was hoping to find love or at least a meaningful connection. On one fateful night, while browsing through profiles on Tinder, I came across a new match named Emily. It was really intriguing and took the time to fill it out, which I appreciated. Her photos were also excellent, but not amazing, as many of them appear to be fake. I'm sure it's worse now, but it was awful back then as well. I initiated contact, and after exchanging a few messages, Emily and I clicked right away. Emily seemed funny and intelligent. She recommended a dive bar in our city that was on the opposite side of town from me, and I accepted. The day came, and I went to the bar feeling a little uneasy. She was blonde with green eyes, and I looked around the room trying to find her. Among the 5 or 10 people there, as I turned my head, she was standing at the woman behind me at the entrance, looked exactly like her photos. I smiled at her, and she smiled back. After an hour or so, we had a table and some drinks, and the conversation flowed naturally and our connection felt genuine, as if we had known each other for a long time. I was pretty happy that everything was going so well. I was shocked when she proposed that we continue a date at her place. I've never been the kind to do that on a first date, but I couldn't resist, so I agreed. We left the bar and began to walk down the sidewalk. She informed me that it would only take 10 minutes to get to her apartment. As we got there, I couldn't help but notice how strangely quiet the building was. It was an older building. It was unsettling, but I couldn't hold Emily responsible because it's difficult to make rent in the city and many buildings are subpar. To be honest, mine wasn't much better at the time I followed her. The hallways were musty, and it appeared that more than half the lights were burned out. The walls had stains, and the carpet was heavily worn down in the middle of the hallway. with several large holes in it. I hoped it was nothing, but as soon as we walked into the apartment, there was a faint smell that I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the same as the smell in the hallway, so I assumed she had pets, perhaps a cat's litter box that needed to be emptied. However, the smell wasn't so strong that I had to leave Emily, so we sat on the couch, her living room, and opened a bottle of wine and carried on talking. Not much happened between us at first, but after about 30 minutes, the door opened. I assumed it was a roommate or something, but she hadn't even told me if she lived alone. A few seconds later, a big man who appeared to be angry and was about my age stood in front of us. He was 6'4", with a long brown beard and a backwards baseball hat, so it wouldn't take a genius to figure out who he was. I knew he was her boyfriend straight away. Emily was crying when I turned to face him, and he was screaming at me to leave. I wasted no time in putting on my shoes and leaving in less than 10 seconds. I couldn't believe what had happened. I assumed Emily was trying to use me to get even with her boyfriend or make him jealous, so she must have planned for him to walk in on us. It was a really dirty move for both of us. Speed walk down the hallway and out of the building to the street, looking back every few steps. No one followed. I caught the bus home still shaking from the adrenaline. I was fortunate that he let me go, because there's no way to know what that guy could have done to me. I unmatched Emily and took a long break from dating apps. I should have reported her for what she did, but I just wanted to be done with it. I never saw or heard from her again. Unfortunately, all of my subsequent dating app experiences have been truly Story 18 positive. In early 2017, was using many popular dating apps, with Tinder being my primary focus at the time, following a string of mediocre days. I was on the verge of giving up, but then I found a pretty promising match. Her name was Leela, and when I saw her bio, I was immediately drawn to it. I swiped right, hoping that we would click, because from what I could see, she seemed like a fun and interesting person. After a few initial messages, our conversation flowed. When the day of our first date came, I messaged her to make sure she would meet me at the park at 7:30. There was a large gate at the front of the park, and that was the location. We effortlessly had a lot in common and seemed to be clicking. We decided to have our first date at a local park so we could decide what to do together. I went there and arrived at the gate, looking around the crowd to see if I could see Leela. Just as I was ready to message her, my phone buzzed with a notification that Leela wanted us to meet at a different location, just a few blocks away. It was just a street corner, and I wasn't sure why she would want to do that. If she was that close, why not just come and meet me? I agreed anyhow, and I began walking. It would only take a few minutes. As I made my way to the new location, I felt a sense of anticipation, as I thought she had simply found a suitable spot, so I wasn't concerned about the abrupt change of plans. However, as soon as I got to the corner where we were supposed to meet, another message from Law appeared on my screen, suggesting that we meet at A. I really wanted to meet her this time, so I agreed and went along with it despite the inconvenience. However, when I got to the third location, I had a weird feeling that it was essentially an alley between two apartment buildings with no other people nearby. I could tell that the place had trouble written all over it, and I knew it instinctively. Something wasn't quite right, but I continued to walk around anyhow because I was too curious to find out what was happening. At this point, I was about 50-50 on lobbying real, but I couldn't let it go. Suddenly, I saw two men approaching me from the opposite side. They were dressed in black and dark jeans, hoodies, and they both wore surgical masks and sunglasses. I started to run in the other direction, but I was blocked from entering the alley by a large man who appeared to be the same as the others, but larger. I scurried around, trying to find a way out, but the only door on one of the buildings was locked. I turned around after shaking the handle for a few seconds and found myself surrounded by three men who were standing motionless in front of me. One of them said, "We're Lilla. I think you know what this is, wallet and phone." I looked at them and fought back tears because I felt so foolish, even though I knew something wasn't right. Nevertheless, I didn't try to convince the man. I just gave them my phone and wallet before they left. One of them threatened to kill me if I called the police, and the frightening thing is that I believed them. After they left, I carefully walked back out into the street. It was already dark, and I looked around, scanning the street for those men, because I didn't want to run into them again. They had left. I walked home, watching over my shoulder the entire way. I considered calling the police, but one of the guy's threats really alarmed me. I was also feeling ashamed, and all I wanted was to move on from the incident. Looking back, I know I should have reported it to alert others, but I actually did not. Never discussed it with anybody until now, and it feels great to finally get it out. Story 19. I was almost 23 when this began, and now that I've learned to be less stubborn, I was a completely different person. I met this man online, when I will call him Dude. He was 40 when we first spoke, and it didn't occur to me that, at his age, he shouldn't be as unique as he was. At the time, I thought he was pretty awesome, but we were best friends, right away, or at least that's how I felt. He listened to me, and would tell me random stories, and his wording was always strange. He spoke as though we were I was in a relationship at the time, and he even made friends with my ex-boyfriend. After we stopped communicating for a year or so, he mysteriously texted me one day and said he had lost all of his contacts except mine. He sent me a picture of my contact on his phone, which was a picture I had sent him, but I ignoring it at the time. It seemed as though our friendship had picked up where it left off. He told me that he was going through a divorce and that I was his supportive friend, but there were boundaries he didn't want to cross. Soon after, we started having regular phone conversations, and he began to imply that he wanted me to help him track down his soon-to-be ex-wife since she wouldn't know me. Red flag number 1, which I actually recognized as a red flag, was that he was too interested in finding out who she was living with. Someone else told me that he was crazy and to avoid him, so I did as I was told and kept talking to the guy even though he said there were lines he didn't want to cross. Red flag number 2 is religion. He never put any pressure on me to join Scientology, but he would always want me to come for moral support for audits and other things. I kept saying no, even though my friend told me to avoid him. However, I didn't listen, and soon the guy wanted to hang out. I tried to say no as politely as I could, saying I was busy, but finally I gave in and sent him my address. I would like to reiterate that this man claimed that we were friends and that there were some things he didn't want me to know. I didn't either, but I meant it. He arrived at my house on his moped. I'm 5 feet 7 inches, and this man, who is now 42, was a foot shorter than me. He put his tongue in my mouth first, and after I ended this unwanted kiss, he looked at me and felt my he repeatedly asked me to ride his moped with him, but I repeatedly refused. My younger sister, who was 17 at the time, came out and said, "I just wanted to make sure you were real because sitting on the driveway in front of you is totally not proof enough." I was extremely uncomfortable, but since I was at my parents' house, I was okay. He became friendly with her right away and wanted to take her out. She agreed, so he drove her around the neighborhood and brought her back. After a while, I decided it was time for him to go, but we continued to talk, and he became very possessive, even though I was still seeing someone else at the time. He then began asking for my sister's number, who is 17 years old, and talking to concerning what he intended to do to us both. But I was too afraid at that point to stop talking to him, because I had given him my address and he knew where my younger sister slept. After he bombarded my phone 4 days with me answering maybe every 20 texts, I finally blocked him, and he began texting my boyfriend to ask where I was and to find out where my younger sister was sleeping. He claimed that I was going to give him my sister's number, but I completely forgot. With the text app I had before, you could still view the messages even if you blocked someone. You just wouldn't receive notifications or see them in your regular text folder. He sent me to 15-page texts, one in Spanish and one in English, and he kept spamming my phone and my now ex's phone for months. Eventually, he simply vanished. Fortunately, I'm 28 years old and haven't heard from him since. I've come to the conclusion that warning signs are warning signs for a purpose, and if your instinct tells you to avoid someone, you should read Story 20. I was single for a while at the time, so I tried online dating. After looking through a ton of profiles, I found Chase, who was tall, attractive, and had the kind of pictures that made me think he might have been a model. His profile stated that he was an engineer, but that might have been a part-time job. I was instantly interested in the model, so I swiped right and we matched. We soon began chatting on the app, and we clicked right away. Jay seemed like the ideal man, and we quickly arranged to go on a date. On the day of our date, I spent hours getting ready because I wanted to look my best for this guy who looked too good to be true. I got to the bar we decided on and looked around the room for Chase. After a few minutes, I noticed a guy across the room waving at me. He didn't look like Chase at all, but I waved back. I went over to him, and he introduced himself as Chase. I was shocked to see that he didn't resemble the photos in his profile at all. He had used photos that weren't of him at all. It wasn't just a few filters and some nice lighting. This was a completely different person. I assumed the photos were taken by a real model. I felt foolish for falling for it. I should have realized it was too good to be true. I didn't want to be cruel, so I sat down and tried to strike up a conversation, but it was obvious that there was no chemistry between us. The date was awkward from the beginning. He seemed to be making too much of an effort to impress me, and I found myself laughing at his stories and jokes. I was also angry that he had misled me, and there was tension between us because we both knew what he had done, but neither of us was discussing it. When I told Chase that I had to leave, he threw a fit in the bar. I left, but he followed me. He began insulting me, accusing me of being shallow and wasting his time, among other things. I was shocked by his response and felt afraid as he followed me down the street. Acting as though I was the one who mistreated him, he actually gaslighted me by catfishing me. I tried to ignore him and move on, but he persisted in yelling at me, growing increasingly hostile, and I began to fear for my safety. I was going to call the police when Chase's patrol car noticed the car and fled just in time because I was going to flag down the police officer. I was so shaken by the entire situation that I deleted my Tinder profile because I couldn't believe that a stranger could be so dangerous and volatile. He totally deceived me and became upset with me for acting as though things weren't all right. That man had a deranged mind to think that way. The creepiest thing, that 6 months after I reinstalled Tinder, I kept seeing the same profile with the model photos. He was still deceiving women and likely treating them the same way he treated me. He didn't even bother to update the pictures. When I reported him to Tinder, they removed the profile, but I'm not sure how many others he has now, so I always ask it Story 21 something, and it happened to me a few years ago when I was a college student. I was in my 3rd year of college, so I can at least make sure that I'm meeting the person in the images. That doesn't mean he won't be a weirdo, though. I was living off campus for a year in a small apartment on the 1st floor of a 3-story building. I had my own room and a roommate with whom I didn't get along, but we had a falling out, and as a result, I lost most of my friends. It was a pretty awkward situation, and I was feeling very lonely at the time. I decided to try out Tinder one day in the hopes of meeting new people, or maybe even find a boyfriend, but I would have been content to just make friends. I looked through a few profiles before finding Ryan, and he seemed nice enough. He actually filled out his profile pretty well, which is something most people don't bother with. He sent me the first message, and we began talking. He asked me out on a date, and I accepted because I figured it couldn't hurt to give him a chance. After the date, I gently informed him that I didn't think we were a good fit because I think it's fair to be honest. He seemed disappointed, but didn't make a scene or anything. We met at a coffee shop close to campus and talked for a while, but there wasn't really anything between us. I could tell he was interested in me, but I didn't feel the same way. Public place. So perhaps that's why he behaved appropriately when we were about to part ways. I noticed a look in his eyes, and while it didn't worry me at the time, looking back, it was really unsettling. At first, everything seemed to be going well. I didn't hear from Ryan for a few days, and I assumed that was the end of it. But then I began to see him around campus more frequently. I assumed it was a coincidence, but after noticing that he appeared to be following me, I tried to ignore it in the hopes that he would eventually understand and leave me alone. However, one day when I was working alone at home on some homework, I was sitting at my desk next to my window when I caught a glimpse of something outside. I went to it and looked out, and it was Ryan spying on me. I was so appalled that I called the police right away. They came and spoke with Ryan, but they were powerless to stop him. Ryan denied that he was looking in my window, claiming that he was simply passing by and that it was just off a busy street, so it seemed plausible to them. I knew the truth, but ever since then, I was constantly watching over my shoulder, felt like I was constantly being watched, even in my apartment, and I began to fear leaving the building because I was constantly afraid Ryan would be waiting for me outside. One day, I was heading to class when I noticed he was following me once more. I tried to get away from him, but he kept getting closer and closer, so I turned and asked him what he wanted from me. I said, "I just want to talk to you." He didn't say anything, but I could tell he wasn't going to give up that easily. I knew I needed to take some protective measures, so I started carrying pepper spray everywhere I went and took a self-defense class. But even with all of those measures, I still felt vulnerable because I didn't know how to stop him, and I was worried that things would only get worse. I confided in my mother and sister. After weeks of feeling like I was being stalked, I finally made the decision to confront Ryan once more. This time, I was more forceful and threatened to call the police if he didn't leave me alone. To my surprise, he eventually backed off. I'm not sure what made him realize his mistake, but I was thankful for the peace of mind I had when I could return. I knew how fortunate I was to escape without suffering any harm when I returned to my regular routine without constantly checking back. I know that many people are not as fortunate, but even though years have passed since this terrifying time in my life, I still remember the sense of vulnerability that came from the story 22. This story occurred when I was 27 years old. I had been using Tinder for a few months without any luck, swiping through innumerable profiles, but no one appeared interested. That is, until I saw Sheila, whose profile photo was her bio stated that she enjoyed hiking, reading, and trying out new restaurants, which is a fairly basic description, but I didn't have many options, so I was glad to get a match at all. We started chatting on the app, and I was shocked by how well we clicked. Her photos were a little blurry, but I could tell she was really gorgeous, flowed easily, and we had a lot in common. After a few days of conversation, I asked if she wanted to meet up, and she said yes. She sent me a location for our meeting, so I didn't give it much thought and didn't even bother to look up the address in advance. On the day of the date, I got in my car and drove, using my GPS to find the address. I had expected to meet in the city, where there would be other people around, but instead I found myself in a desolate area with no signs of life. The trees towered over me, and I felt scared. I tried to ignore the feeling and continued driving until I reached the address, where I pulled up to an old abandoned house. I was lost in the country, surrounded by wheat fields, and there were no bars or restaurants. My heart fell when I saw the house with the boarded up windows and the rusty fence around it. I knew right away that something was wrong, so I panicked and turned around. I wasn't sure if Sheila was real, but I couldn't take the chance. The house looked like it was from a horror film, so I headed back to the city. I tried to speed up when I saw a car following me, but it stayed right behind me and even bumped into the back of my car once, making me swerve a little. I was so perplexed, but I kept driving in the hopes that the car would eventually give up and turn around, and as soon as I got to the city limits, it did, and sped away in the opposite direction. I sighed with relief and pulled over to the side of the road because my hands were shaking and my heart was racing. I wasn't driving home right away because I was cautious to make sure I wasn't being followed. Instead, I drove around the city for about 30 minutes before pulling into a gas station parking lot. I took out my phone to text Sheila, but I discovered that her Tinder profile had been removed. This wasn't totally shocking, but I wasn't thinking clearly at the time and still kind of believed she was real. I realized that the entire situation had been set up, and my mind was racing with questions about who Sheila was and why. The only match one found on Tinder turned out to be a crazy person who attempted to run me off the road. They probably would have done much worse to me if I had gone into that situation. She wanted me to meet her in the middle of nowhere, who was in the car that followed me. What did they want? I knew I had avoided a bullet and was thankful to be alive, but I also felt disappointed and used it as a real blow to my self-esteem. Story 23. When I was 24, I downloaded Tinder for the first time. I wish it had been the last time, but it wasn't. I got a lot more messages. I swore off Tinder after that incident because I couldn't trust anyone on the app anymore, and I didn't want to put myself in harm's way again. Darren was one of them right away. He was funny and charming in his messages, and we hit it off right away. He was a tall, muscular man with short hair and a smile that could light up a room. We decided to meet up for drinks at a local bar in the city, and when I got there, I was a little nervous, but Darren made me feel comfortable with his kind manner. We ordered drinks and discussed our hobbies, families, and our experiences on Tinder. Everything was going smoothly until we left the bar and began to walk down the street. Suddenly, a man with a knife arrived and demanded our phones and wallets. I froze in fear, but Darren didn't think twice and moved in front of me, facing the robber with his fists up in defense. The robber then lunged forward with I suggested that we call the police, but Darren insisted that I see the man's face clearly. He was most likely in his late 20s, with a patchy beard and an old baseball hat. He dodged his knife, counterattacked, and threw the man to the ground. The mugger scrambled to get back up, and then fled with his tail between his legs. It was a terrifying experience, but Darren stepped up and I felt grateful and impressed by his actions. I didn't say anything at the time, but he walked me home close to my house, and I said goodbye. On was firm, but he refused to call the police. I finally let the matter go. Darren was fishing for an invitation to my place, just to be safe. Block or two away from my building. He obviously wanted some action, but I wasn't into it. I didn't hear from him for a few days after that night, so I thought he had moved on. But one day I got a message from him asking me out again, and I politely declined, explaining that I did not feel a romantic connection, and I assumed that would be the end of it. However, Darren did not take well to my rejection, and he began sending me threatening and angry texts. I won't go into details, but it was really awful stuff. I tried to reason with him, telling him that I had been honest, but he refused to listen, acting as though he felt entitled. I reasoned that perhaps, because he shielded me from that robber who believed I owed him something, I was afraid and uneasy, wondering if he was following or watching me. I tried to ignore his messages, but they kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. After a few frightening days, the calls and messages stopped, looking as though he had moved on. I had no idea what the man's issue was. I was relieved that it was over, but the story doesn't end there. About a month later, I was strolling down the street on a Saturday afternoon when I noticed Darren approaching me on the sidewalk. He was with another man they didn't see, and I assumed that by then, at the age of 28, he would have learned how to handle rejection. I hurried to hide behind a building, but as they passed, I noticed something startling. The other man with Darren was the mugger from our date. For a moment, I was perplexed, but then I understood that the mugger was actually a friend of his who had set him up to do it, so he could act heroic and avoid calling the police. I watched anxiously as they walked. I sincerely hoped that they wouldn't turn around down the sidewalk. I still wonder what he would have done if we had dated. He would have had to break up with his friend, or I would have known what he did. I suppose he didn't think it would go that far anyhow. That guy had really bad intentions, and I'm glad my instincts were right when it